Welcome to the third installment of the basic income course, and today we'll be giving an introduction, or I will be giving an introduction into the idea of basic income, what it is, where it comes from, and how to think about it in terms of a social critique and how to think about it in terms of a social policy. So here's a starting point. Basic income goes back a long time. So this is actually a classic. Thomas Paine. By the way, Thomas Paine wrote a very famous book called Rights of Man, which was instrumental in actually the American independence, right? So that's how far it goes back, right? So he actually wrote a piece called Agrarian Justice, in which he wrote the following proposal: to create a national fund out of which there shall be paid to every person the sum of £10 per year during life, to every person now living of the age of 50 years, and to all others as they shall arrive at that age. So something like a basic pension. And it's proposed that the payments, as already stated, be made to every person, rich and poor alike. So I've emphasized all these bits, that every person to all, independent of rich and poor, because this is one of the first clear statements of something like a basic income, which is an income that is supposed to apply to everyone universally. Doesn't make any distinctions between whether you're rich or poor, whether you belong to a particular group, yes or no, right? Classic idea. Actually, historians have actually gotten really into this topic, and they've traced it back even further, but then we get into quite a lot of obscure sources. Thomas Paine is a very famous one. This is like the Thomas Piketty of his day, if you want, right? So, famous proposal a couple of 100 years ago already. So where are we at today? So, if you look at Google Trends, media attention, basically for many, many years basic income wasn't talked about at all. You had a couple of people, a couple of organizations around, that was it. So you had this little couple of attention until the last year, or the last year and a half, 2015. Actually, 2013 it starts, when the Swiss referendum, the first initiative, came up. But since then, we've seen really a huge spike in attention. So at the moment, we find basic income everywhere on the media. Lots of websites, a lot of blog posts, Twitter, you name it, Facebook, huge amount of Facebook groups, right? Everyone talks about it, different groups, up to decision makers now, right? So this is just media attention. But actually, if you think about events, for example, so the Swiss referendum was very, very important, right? Now, you may notice that the Swiss, when they voted last June, they actually voted against the proposal, right? So there was only, about 23% of the people participating in the vote who voted in favor. So you could say, well, great, the Swiss voted, they voted against, so, we're done with this. Actually, not true at all. 23% for, a quite radical proposal, that's a lot in a referendum, right? The most important thing actually is what happened before. Because when that initiative, so the way it works in Switzerland is you have to have 100,000 people signing an initiative before a topic becomes part of the referendum, right? When that happened, they had 123,000 people voting in. That's when basic income became news. That's when basic income became news, not just in Switzerland, but everywhere around the world. So the impact of the Swiss referendum is a huge thing, independent of whether they actually voted in favor or against, right? And to be honest, 23% in favor in a campaign that was actually very controversial. I mean, it was a very inspirational campaign. I don't know how many people have seen this picture. This is basically like the coins. Each of these coins represent a citizen in Switzerland. So one of their campaign stunts was dumping this in front of Parliament, right? Another campaign stunt they did just before the referendum was the largest ever poster, which said, what would you do if you had a basic income? And that poster traveled around the world. So huge campaign, great in terms of visibility. But at the same time in Switzerland, all the political parties were advocating against. So this is a result of 23% against the whole political class, if you want. So that's quite a good result, right? And it probably means that there will be another vote, there will be another referendum some years from now, right? That topic is not done in Switzerland. But the most important part of Switzerland is that it really put basic income on the map. So then we get to you guys, right? So here was the biggest surprise in 2015. Your new government suddenly had a little line saying, we're going to experiment with basic income. No one knew that this was going to happen. Everyone I speak to in Finland basically says it totally took them by surprise, right? Everyone outside in Finland had no idea what was going to happen, right? We were all looking at this as like, this is amazing. An actual country, an actual government is going to experiment at a national level with the basic income. Of course, a lot of stuff happened since, and you know, there's big debates at the moment of what the government's proposing, whether it's really a basic income and is it not, you know, is it not too weak and so on and so forth. A lot of criticism, a lot of disappointment. But, you know, I'm going to leave that topic until, you know, Olli Kangas will come and talk to you. So he is the man running the show. So, you know, you can get all the updated information from him. The important bit is that this is not just Finland. I mean, Finland was the first one to announce that this was going to be piloted, was going to be experimented upon. But this is where we are at the moment. So more or less around the same time in the Netherlands, a number of cities. So in Finland it's from the national government, but in Netherlands it's municipalities. A number of cities are proposing the same. They're at the moment negotiating with their government, and there's draft legislation, just the same as in Finland. There's draft legislation being considered by the parliament. So with a bit of luck, the Dutch people will also be having an experiment more or less around the same time, but only in 4 cities, so not a national one. In Canada, in Ontario, and a bit, well, we're not quite sure yet about Quebec, there's a lot of interest, but in Ontario for sure, the provincial government is very interested as well, so they're in the midst of preparing the same research that Kela has been doing here, right? In France, only last week, there was a big influential report from the Senate saying, look, this is a great idea. We need to seriously think about experimenting with basic income in France, right? And a number of ministers have signed up to this. So we'll see. We'll see where the French debate goes. Switzerland, we've already mentioned, but Lausanne, the city of Lausanne independently wants to experiment. So Switzerland, of course, is very, you know, is a very complicated politically country, but there's a lot of independence in the cities and the regions, right, and the different cantons. So Lausanne possibly could be experimenting very soon as well. And then there's a number of projects that are not related to governments, right? So Give Directly, does anyone know Give Directly here? You ever heard of it? So Give Directly is a development organization, an NGO, that basically for the last, I think they're around for about 10 years or so, that they've decided to bypass all these organizations. And their idea is, you look, if we want to help poor people in developing countries in Africa, we need to get the money to them directly, give directly, right? So they've been doing this. Now, one of the things that they got interested in this basic income, and they say, okay, we're also going to do an experiment. So they started crowdfunding. I think they have about 30 million American dollars that they're willing to spend. And they're looking at villages in east of Africa, I think mostly Kenya. And they really want to build an experiment that's universal, but also, and this is very important, that's long term. All the experiments in countries like Finland and the Netherlands, we're talking about 2-year experiments. Why? Because it costs a lot of money, right? I mean, it costs a lot of money to experiment. In a country like Kenya, with, you know, with the same amount of money, you can do really, really long-term experiments. So they're going to plan this for 10, 15 years to see what the long-term effects are of basic income in this particular context. And then we got another sort of one that you may have seen in the news. So Y Combinator, that's one of these high-tech startup firms, right? They usually fund like startup projects. So they're, you know, they're investors basically, right? So they got interested in basic income. So you now have a lot of these high-tech firms who really like basic income because they think, you know, the robot's going to steal the jobs, and so they're all getting into this. This Silicon Valley is going crazy about basic income at the moment. These guys want to do a little experiment in Oakland, you know, around San Francisco or in San Francisco. So this is just a variety of what's going on at the moment. So it's not just Finland, you know, it's a lot of other countries at various levels trying to play around with this, right? But seriously play around. I mean, not just, you know, this is not just messing around. This is serious research. There quite a lot of political commitment, okay? And then we've got a number of organizations that are quite high profile. So you put all these things together, basic income within 2 years basically went from here to there, right? Okay. Now, the whole point of this is to give you a little bit of an overview of like, yeah, this is all really, really exciting. But since this is a social policy course, the question now is, what does that really mean? I mean, you know, does that mean that basic income is going to be on the agenda? Is it really easy to push it on the agenda? Do we have all the answers? Is it easy to implement, and so on and so forth? So the whole purpose of this course is, in a sense, is to look at this, what's going on here, and to start thinking about all the challenges that you face when you come with an idea like basic income and you want to turn it into a social policy, right? So first question, what is basic income really? So basic income basically is three things, three fundamental conditions. It has to be universal, it has to be individual, and it has to be unconditional. So let me explain each of these. So the universal bit means that everyone should get it, right? Seems very straightforward. Now, think about social support programs, think about social protection, think about social policy. Pretty much every social policy that you can come up with, especially when it comes to social protection, income maintenance, is focused on specific groups, right? It's all about identifying particular groups, targeting a program specifically to them. So, you know, the examples here, unemployment insurance, you have to be unemployed. Disability benefits, you have to, you know, fit a certain measure of disability. Social assistance programs, usually, you know, unemployed and means tested, right? Basic pensions, child benefit, each of these, and you can start adding more. They're all focused on specific groups. What is basic income? Basic income basically says, look, we're going to get rid of these ideas of focusing on groups and we're going to go universal. Everyone, by virtue of being a citizen or a resident, gets the same basic income. Now, there's going to be a question, and you know, whenever I mention this, people immediately say, yeah, what is it? Is it citizens or is it residents? So that is a debate, right? That is an ongoing debate. So, you know, and especially in a world in which people travel around a lot, right? So there is a lot of immigration, there's a lot of people moving around in and out of the country. We're going to have to figure out how that applies. So a standard proposal is to do something similar to what we do with most social policies, which is the moment you enter into a country, there might be a waiting period, but at some point, you know, you qualify for programs, right? In many countries, maybe you have to wait for 6 months or a year or 2 years, whatever. We can have debates about what's appropriate, right? But it's not a huge issue to think about this and saying that, look, we're talking about citizens and permanent residents, people who are properly embedded in the country, okay? That's the starting point, but there's no selectivity. Apart from that, once you have identified who is a citizen and a proper resident, there's no different conditions coming into it, right? Apart from that, everyone receives it, everyone's equally entitled. Does that mean that there's no targeting? Actually, not necessarily, because even within the basic income, actually the people who are benefiting most are the ones who are on the bottom of the income distribution, right? So even if everyone gets a basic income, the rich and the poor, it's always going to be the poor who benefit most. So there is targeting. This is a program that is geared at the most vulnerable, the most disadvantaged, the most poor, right? But it doesn't in advance specify who these poor people are. It doesn't in advance specify criteria of what is it to be disadvantaged, what is it to be vulnerable, what is it to be poor, what is it to, and so on and so forth, right? So I hope you understand that. So it's universal in one way. We're getting rid of all these categories. But that doesn't mean that a basic income doesn't have different effects for different groups of people. It's important to keep in mind. Because one objection, people always say, why should we pay the rich? Well, one of the reasons why we pay the rich is because it's actually the best way to pay the poor. right? One of the reasons, one of the biggest problems that we have is that a lot of these programs, because they are conditional, because they are within categories, it means that sometimes people fall out of it, right? So if you become disabled, or you have this sort of disability where, you know, maybe 6 months in a year, it turns out you can work and you can have a job, but then your disability flares up and, you know, you have to go back on support and so on and so forth. If you're one of these people who has to change from categories, then that's a problem. A lot of administrative systems with conditions and categories, they have a problem with that, right? Do you know the filmmaker Ken Loach? You've heard of him? Do you know a movie called I, Daniel Blake? It won a prize in Cannes recently. This is a movie, I really, seriously, you should, if you have a chance, if it's coming out here, go and see it. This is a movie, it's very, very realistic. This is a movie about following a guy who goes through this thing. It's in the UK context, but it's a similar problem. This is a guy who has a heart attack, goes and asks for, you know, kind of disability support, goes through a lot of questions, but gets refused because the questions don't ask about his heart. They do, you know, they do other sorts of tests. Finds himself in the weird situation of having to apply for sort of in-work support, but is not allowed to work by his doctor. So he finds himself literally in a situation where, you know, he doesn't fit the categories, you know, and he's effectively losing, I mean, he has no income, he's losing his house, he's losing all these sort of things. It's an amazing, well, it's, you know, it's a very hard story and it's a very hard movie to watch, but it illustrates exactly what's often going wrong with, if you have social protection with a lot of different categories, right? Even if everyone fits into a category, people often move around. And there's always going to be gaps, and there's always people who fall through the gaps, right? And if you're poor, for example, you know, if you're literally surviving on an income on a weekly basis, and the administration makes a mistake, as sometimes happens, and it takes time to rectify the mistake, right? If that happens, then you have a serious, serious problem, right? Okay? Basic income wants to do away with all that. The argument is that, look, we make it universal, we make it unconditional, right? And we pay the rich because at the end of the day, it's just better for the poor. It's a proper safety net in that sense. Individual. So that was universal. Individual. Why individual? Well, again, similar thing. Pretty much all social support programs today are based on household, based on a family, right? And you know, we know where that's coming from. I mean, this comes from a time when we were building a welfare state where we had very clear views of what the family was, what a household was, you know? 2 people and whatever, 2.4 children. That's the standard, therefore we're building social policy on the basis of the standard. But the standard has changed, right? Families, households are very fluid at the moment. People go in and out of relationships and so on and so forth, right? That too creates problems. It creates problems when what I'm entitled to partly depends on my partner, right? It becomes very complicated. And especially if, you know, if both of us are moving in and out of work or moving through different jobs and so on, as more and more is happening, it becomes very complicated. So the same problems arise because nothing to do with universal now with categories, but because it's focused on household. So the proposal of basic income is it has to be individual. So not just universal, it has to be individual. Every single person as a citizen or long-term resident is entitled to this, independent of your household situation, right? So it means it's individually calculated and it's individually paid, right? Which are 2 very, very different things, by the way. It's one thing to have it individually calculated, but if it all still goes into one account, that means we get all these complicated things about, you know, intra-household poverty and so on. And that's a reality, right? I mean, we have figures on this. There's a reality that within households today, even when there's money in the household, that doesn't mean the money is equally distributed within the people in the household, right? So basic income, and this is one of the reasons why, for example, feminists like basic income, because it basically says it secures money to women, right? Now, a lot of these things, they may, you know, in the Nordic countries, in Finland and, you know, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, a lot of this is slightly less of an issue, but you go elsewhere in Europe, you'd be surprised how much that is a real problem. So individuality, for sure, in a European context is a huge issue, right? Okay, so that's the second thing. So we had universal, we had individual, and then the most controversial, basic income is unconditional. What does that mean? Again, every program that we have today, you have to satisfy certain conditions. Sometimes these are categorical conditions, like, you know, if you're a pensioner, you're a pensioner, right? It's a particular sort of category. But sometimes these are behavioral conditions, like you have to apply for a job, you have to show to apply for a job, you have to willing to work. If you're not willing to work, you have to you have to be willing to educate yourself, to train yourself, and so on and so forth. Lots of conditions attached to receiving benefits and receiving support. And more of this. We have a history of the past couple of decades of conditionality being imposed more and more, right? As part of an active welfare state activation and so on and so forth. Basic income, again, radically takes a different way. No conditionality. The only condition is that you are a citizen or a resident. That's it. You know, the moment you satisfy that, the state is not in the business to tell you how to behave. That's effectively the scenario underlying it. That means there's no means test. It goes to the rich, it goes to the poor. No income test, no asset test. Very important distinction, by the way, right? Because there's a lot of people who have no income, but they have assets. So if you're, for example, you may be someone who at some point owns a house, but you lose your job, say later in life you lose your job or you become a pensioner. Your income may be very, very low, but you actually have an asset. In many countries, the state will say, well, first you sell your house, and then you apply for benefits. But this is a spiral, right? It's a spiral that makes people more poor. Right? So no asset test, no income test. No work or willingness to work tests, right? No corresponding obligations in that sense, right? So the idea is we give people a basic floor and we trust them to participate in various sort of ways. Okay? Now that's very controversial, and actually José Noguera, the Spanish guy, will talk about all this very specifically in his lecture. This is all about reciprocity and obligations. He's going to be talking about that. So here is a third thing, no restrictions on the use, right? This is cash, and the cash doesn't come with any restrictions. Now, again, there's actually a lot of trends, maybe not so much in Finland, but in a lot of other countries, there's trends to put restrictions on how people can use their cards. So there's proposals to have like special like credit card, debit cards, for poor people, which means that you can go to a shop, but you know, you're not allowed to pay whatever. You can't get your cigarettes and your drinks and lottery tickets and so on. There's proposals, I know in the United States, for example, is they come up with lists where, you know, say the steak, the good meat is not to be, you know, if you're poor, you can have kidneys and liver and, you know, some of the cheap stuff, but you shouldn't be paying the state's money, so to speak, for good food, right? But that means the state gets into the business of deciding what is appropriate use of money, as opposed to trusting people to more or less, you know what they want with their lives and how to build their lives, right? So you can see how underlying this, you know, this is about practicalities, no test, but there's a whole different philosophy underlying this as well. It's a philosophy about the state not being in the business to controlling people so much, okay? Key point. So, three features, right? Universal, individual, unconditional. You put these three together, you have a basic income, right? Any of these is not in place, it's not really a basic income, okay? So, with these features, we have one idea, basic income, but that idea still means we have a lot of different models out there. So there's a lot of variation within that idea. So here are just some examples of how we can have variation. The level of the income itself can be very different. So people in the literature talk about a full basic income, which is up to the poverty line, or a partial basic income, which is a lot less. So the proposal that the government here now is going to experiment with is a partial basic income, right? It's 560 euros, I think. Is now the last and hopefully final proposal. But 560 euros, of course, is not enough to live on, right? So it's a partial basic income. On top of that, you need income from different sources, whether it's work, whether it's other type of assistance, and so on, Okay? But you will have that distinction. So you're going to have people having big debates about which types of model to apply. The funding source, very different as well. You know, the classic idea is to fund this through regular taxes. Regular taxes basically being income taxes, right? But there's a lot of other proposals out there. There's a lot of people proposing we should have special wealth tax to pay for something like a basic income. Perhaps we can use green taxes. Perhaps we can use something like Tobin taxes on financial transactions, right? Lots of different ideas out there, right? Some people argue, look, we'll take whatever is in a particular country, whatever system is in place, and we'll try and find a way to put basic income there, to fit it in there. Other people take a very different view and say, no, we want to find an extra funding source that can pay for the basic income. Big debates about this. Lots of different things going on. Third one, duration. So the general idea is that we have a basic income for life. You get it when you have become a kid, when you are a kid, when you get born. Maybe when you're born, it's like a child benefit. It's not that much money. But, you know, as soon as you become 18, you get a proper one. And then maybe when you become a pensioner, it might be slightly different again, right? So there could be some variation over life, but you get it from birth to death, so to speak, okay? But then there's other people basically saying, well, you know, maybe another idea would be to have something like a basic income for 5 years. So imagine that all of us were entitled to 5 years of basic income. But we decide ourselves when we pick it up. So some of us say, look, you know, I want to pick this up because, you know, I just had a child. I've done my paternity leave or my maternity leave. But in addition to that, I actually want to spend more time at home. So I take up my basic income. Or I find an opportunity to start a business. And actually at this particular moment, this basic income would really, really help me because it supports my business, right? Like a small business. Or maybe, you know, later in life, I want to go back to school again. I want to study. I'm going to use the basic income to help me with that, right? Different things. But, you know, 5 years, everyone's entitled to it. But you decide yourself when you pick it up. Very different proposal from the lifelong one, okay? So we can have debates about this, which one is good. Implementation as well. Very different ways of doing it. So one way would be to give everyone like a credit card, special credit card, you know? Basic income goes on there and that's it, everyone has it. Another way is to do it through the taxes, you know, in a way that, you know, if you are paying taxes, it gets deducted from your taxes. And if you're not paying taxes or not paying that many taxes, you know, you get it as a cash thing, right? So this actually, you know, different ways of implementing, but it has important consequences in terms of how we institute the basic income, but also important consequences in terms of how people respond to this. You know, there's a lot of studies showing that people respond to money very differently, whether it's get as a cash or it's something that's, you know, that's implemented through a tax thing, for example, right? So we're going to have debates about this. So now my only point here is that we have one idea, basic income, but actually we have a lot of different proposals within that. So we need to have a lot of debates about, you know, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a partial basic income funded through income tax, you know, which will be implemented through the taxes and is lifelong? That's a very different proposal from, you know, you can have all the variation here, okay? So I hope that gives you a bit of an idea. So we have the idea of basic income and we have different versions, right? Now, one of the things you're going to notice, when people talk about basic income, they often talk about the idea. And then they say, well, a basic income will do this. Now, if you're a good policy scholar, then you say, well, we'll have to see. We have to look at the details. That's where that stuff is coming in. When you think about basic income as policy, we're talking about concrete proposals, concrete schemes, right? So every time someone tells you, well, basic income will do this, or basic income will do that, and it's going to go wrong, and so on, your simple question should be, what is it exactly you're talking about? Tell me which basic income that it is that you're talking about. And then we can have a proper discussion. So I want to do two things to finish off this session. I want to talk about basic income as a social critique. This sort of broad idea that somehow basic income is going to change our world. Our world is messed up and basic income is the answer, right? I will say something about that. That's one way to really look at it. Another way is then to think of basic income more as social policy, something that is more about, well, perhaps there's a lot of problems with our system, but within the system, we need to nevertheless start changing things. Very different perspectives, right? So here is the idea. One of the ideas that we often talk about is this, social policy and income protection and welfare states is all about a social contract. It's a sort of contract between citizens and the state, right? And this whole talk about social contract very much after the World War, this is what happened, right? After the Second World War, there was all this talk about we need to rebuild our societies in various ways, and the welfare state was part of the new social contract, okay? Now, one of the things that we see happening in, over the last couple of decades is that the social contract has broken down in various ways. So we see economic inequality rising, we see economic insecurity rising, right? So, I mean, people here, I'm sure you've heard or you've even maybe read Thomas Piketty, which, this was the guy who 2 years ago wrote a big bestseller, and suddenly economic inequality was never talked about really, but now suddenly it became this big mainstream issue. So now regular economists are working on economic inequality, and we find that this is a huge problem, right? And it's a huge problem for all sorts of reasons, but one of the things it does is it breaks the social contract, because economic inequality means that whatever arrangement we have in place, a particular group is benefiting a lot more than another group. That's not much of a social contract in that sense, right? So that's put that under pressure. Another issue that's come up a lot, stable jobs. So the understanding of the initial social contract was that we would have something close to full employment. At least one person in a household would have a stable job. And over time, of course, women enter the labor market, there would be more, and so on and so forth. But job stability is a key feature of, building up a pension, building up entitlements, and so on and so forth. Now we're in a situation of precariousness, where larger and larger groups of people never have these stable jobs. They move between, unemployment, employment, but always in temporary contracts. Temporary contracts that don't really build up extra benefits, entitlements, right? They're a lot less paid, so you have people who always hover around poverty, and always insecurity, economic insecurity is tied in with that. Now, the whole debate about automation, the robots stealing the job, is the idea that this is going to get worse, right? So the idea now is that as robots become more able to take on a lot of our tasks, one of the scenarios is that more and more labor will just disappear. Robots literally will take on the jobs. What do we do with all these people? Well, one of the answers, or the answer that these people put forward is, well, that's where a basic income comes in. Because the basic income doesn't depend on being in a job. We'll see. We'll see where that goes. Next week, Willeveke will talk about that, so you get to ask him loads of things about that. And the third issue about the social contract is the care agenda. So one of the things that's been come up more and more and more is that there is a lot of work being done, but it's not through the labor market. It's not as part of this idea of having a job. And this is care work in the broadest sense, Mostly this is done by women, right? And mostly this is to do with, taking care of children and taking care of parents, And again, in the Nordic countries, you have an extremely generous, support for children and support for older people. Check out Italy, check out Spain, check out Greece, check out the UK, and there's total different stories. So there, you actually see that there's a lot more reliance even on this informal work to pick up the slack, right? So 3 different ways in which a social contract is broken down. So now this has been going on for a couple of decades, right? So, but what we've experienced now with the financial crisis is more pressure on this. So then we have austerity politics. So with the financial crisis, we had all the governments in Europe pretty much having one response. We need to balance the budget. Let's cut social provisions as much as possible, right? What's the biggest problem with cutting social provisions? Well, we used to have this program which is called the active welfare state. And the active welfare state was all about, making sure that people are activated into work. Because work was the way out. Work is the way out of poverty. Now, we have two problems now with austerity. First of all, we have a lot more unemployment, so less jobs. But also, putting people into work actually costs a lot of money. I mean, activation, social investment, costs a lot of money. This is, these are all these programs, all the administrative programs to train people into work, have all these sort of issues around that. That is a very costly thing. Austerity now says, well, there's no longer any money. So we have a paradox. I mean, on the one hand, we keep saying that people have to get into work. People have to find their own way, take their own responsibility, be independent. But all the support that we used to have is now being put under pressure as well. So clearly austerity is just putting the social contract further in problems, right? So if you buy that story, I mean, this of course, this is a complicated story and I'm just giving you the 2-minute version. If you buy the story that social contract is broken, then we really need to search for alternatives. Now, the idea of basic income as social critique is that basic income can provide the alternative, right? So this is the idea that basic income is the solution to this huge mess that we're in at the moment. So what is the transformative agenda, if you want? What is it that basic income is trying to transform? Well, here are some examples. So we already mentioned care and the gender inequality. So the idea is with the basic income, we're going to start appreciating informal work and care work, right? Women who stay at home more, who take different career paths because they have to take care of children or they want to take care of children, whatever, we can have debates about that. But, in those sort of circumstances, basic income at least supports that. It gives some appreciation of the sort of work that's done at home, if you want, or outside of the labor market. There's also ecological considerations. I mean, obviously, we have huge issues around climate change, and one of the issues there is that it's all driven by growth, economic growth, right? There's a whole scenario called post-productivism where basic income in some sense is a way of redistributing wealth and security, but without putting an emphasis on this growth, right? So there's a scenario, there's a reason why a lot of the green parties, for example, pretty much in every country, green parties are the ones that favor basic income, largely because they're interested in these models that don't push the growth factor all the time, the industry thing. Distribution, economic inequality, I've mentioned that already. If we have a system where everyone has a floor, and that system in some sense goes with progressive taxation so that, in some ways the rich are paying, the richer are paying for the basic income for the poor, then we're going to have, better distribution, decrease economic inequality. I'll skip the redistribution, pre-distribution thing. That's it's not that important at the moment. But the final one I think is worthwhile. I mean, thinking about social inclusion, not just as labor market participation. So the idea, we have this weird idea in the active welfare state, which is the following. Either you sit on your sofa like Homer Simpson, or you have a job. I mean, that's just weird, right? I mean, there's so many things going on in society that depend on people being active in various sort of ways. Volunteering, all sorts of associations, you name it. You can come up with so many examples of community level involvement. And in some ways, the basic income scenario here is we free up people from this sort of need to be participating in a labor market that's already problematic anyway, right? Keep in mind that jobs are disappearing, becoming more precarious and so on. It actually gives people the opportunity not just to become Homer Simpson, but actually to become active in a society in a sort of a general social participation type of way, right? Now, I'm not saying that all this is true. I'm not putting this to you as statements. I'm saying these are scenarios, they're agendas. So when people are talking about the transformation ability of basic income, those are the lines around which they were thinking, right? But of course, the question still is this going to happen? I mean, so then from a social policy perspective, you need to start thinking about mechanisms. Like, if we give a basic income to women, is that really giving them more freedom? Right? Here is one alternative scenario. Maybe in a household, if we give a basic income, maybe in the household then there's sort of a decision where they say, well, one of us can work a bit less. Who should it be? oh, maybe women should work a bit less. And we're back to a scenario where, in some weird way, basic income might actually be supporting the older traditional view of the family, where women are staying proportionally more home and men are proportionally back to trying to fill the full-time job, right? We don't know, right? So there's a lot of these things we literally don't know. So we have to think about scenarios in both directions and start thinking about that properly, right? Really very, very clearly. Social justice. We're actually not going to have a philosopher in our lecture series. We used to have one, but the philosopher got kicked out because I didn't have a lot of, because we only have 8 sessions basically. So, but in philosophy, political philosophy, there is a big debate about linking basic income to social justice. Really, fundamental principles. And they're talking about it in different ways. A lot of different approaches argue that basic income is a condition for freedom. And interestingly, this is libertarians who are on the right wing of the political spectrum, but a lot of people on the left wing as well, thinking about basic income as a measure of freedom. Different views on freedom, right? And different views on why basic income is important, but the freedom component is very important. One obvious way in which this is the case, if basic income is unconditional, and the state no longer controls what you can do and under what conditions, obviously in one sense you're going to become a lot more free, right? So issues around democratic participation as well. Democratic theorists, actually, going back a couple of centuries already, people have always argued that one condition of being a citizen is that you need to have some independence, It used to be the case that you were only entitled to vote if you had property. The reason was that if you had property, you were independent. Therefore, you were not voting because of someone else's views, right? I mean, think back, the good old days of the Industrial Revolution, when the boss in the factory would tell the workers how to vote, right? And if you didn't vote like the boss, then you were kicked out. And by the way, there's a lot of evidence showing that in the United States, for example, this is still happening. Right? There's still a lot of corporations putting pressure. So independence in that sense, political independence and economic independence may well be somehow linked. The democratic argument is that basic income sort of disconnects that, right? Basic income gives you at least some measure of independence, right? So that's the scenario. And then entitlement justifications. This is all about the idea that a lot that we have in the world is actually common property. It's not private property, like clean air. That's a commons. Nature is a commons. Technology that we inherit from past generations, that's a commons, right? I mean, this is something that comes to us as a group. This is not something that should be necessarily privately owned. A lot of this stuff is privately appropriated, right? A lot of this stuff is then becoming patented in various sort of ways, or, like in the case of clean air. We have issues around pollution and so on and so forth. So the arguments around entitlement is all about, well, we need to protect the commons, and the commons belong to all of us. So, for example, if a factory wants to use natural resources, they should pay for that. Who should get the money? Well, each citizen should get the money, right? As a basic income, right? That's the best way to distribute. It shouldn't go to the state, because the state can do it in various ways. This is an entitlement that we have as a citizen, therefore we should all be getting it, okay? So this is just examples, freedom, democracy, entitlement, huge amount of philosophy discussions going on about this, okay? Several people might touch on a few of these bits, but we're not going to have a specific lecture on this. Then a final session, just, and I'm sort of closing up very fast now, because of course social policy is what we're going to be talking about mostly in the next couple of weeks, right? So, but just to kind of give you a couple of points here. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's in the social policy section. He's actually a political philosopher, but, or was, he passed away a few years ago. But this is a really, really great quote. So Brian Barry writes the following. So this is in a paper where he talks about, whether basic income is desirable or not, pros and cons. He says, asking about the pros or cons of basic income as such is like asking about the pros and cons of keeping a feline. as a pet without distinguishing between a tiger or a tabby, right? Tabby is a house cat, right? So very straightforward point, you know, and it kind of goes back to the point that I made earlier, right? Someone asks you, is basic income a good idea? Your question should be, which basic income? The same way Brian Berry says, someone asks you, keeping a feline is a good idea. Having a house cat, sure. Having a tiger, maybe not so much a good idea, right? But it's again pushing at this point that we need to get at the details. When we talk about social policy, the details really, really matter, right? And they matter in various ways. So here is 3 ways to think about this. So when we think about basic income as a family of proposals, we've already talked about design and implementation. I mean, I talked about the level and the funding and, you know, implementing through the tax or not. You know, those are the discussions, right? But then these choices, they feed back into policy effects, right? So policy effects is the sort of stuff that the basic income is supposed to be doing, what it's for. Now, people have argued that basic income is good for poverty, or it's good for inequality, or it's good for health. Evelyn Forget from Canada will be talking about the health component, which is really exciting, actually. There's a lot of evidence now coming up and a lot of arguments that something like a basic income could really be good for health, right, as an issue. Education, social participation, you name it. You can have a different social goal. And then you think about, okay, does basic income have a positive effect on this, or a negative effect, or maybe just no effect? We need to know this stuff. But that's going to be tied in. So we have the design, the details. They are going to determine whether we have policy effects. So, you know, the level of a basic income obviously is going to depend, you know, let me reverse it. Whether or not basic income is good for poverty is going to depend on how much you get from a basic income, right? It's also going to depend on the funding and so on and so forth. So, you know, you see how design and implementation and policy effects fit together. But then there's a next step. And this is something that I'm going to be talking about. I'll be talking to you about the politics of basic income. There's also something called political effects. Political effects is all about figuring out who wins and loses. You know, every change you do in a policy is always going to create some winners, some losers. There's always going to be people who were better off with the previous arrangement and some who are better off with the current arrangement or the next arrangement, right? That's pretty much unavoidable. And that's what politics is about. Politics is who gets what, under what conditions, when. You know, winners and losers. But that also means once we think about winners and losers and how basic income distributes that, we can start thinking about political feasibility. We can start thinking about political stability. You know, whether a basic income is something that is really stable, or is it something that maybe the next government is just going to take away again? And we have examples of that. We have examples of policies that were put in place by one government and the next one took it away again because it didn't build a constituency, because it didn't build a proper coalition, right? So political questions are very important, right? But again, they depend on the policy effects. It's the policy effects that create the winners and the losers. And it's the winners and the losers that then will tell you whether a particular proposal can get us a political coalition or not, right? So, and this gets to the final point. I mean, when you think about basic income, I've said several times now, basic income is a variety of things. But actually we can think about, in terms of politics, we can think about clusters. We can think about models of basic income that are progressive and models of basic income that are conservative, right? So one of the things that people often say in relation to basic income is it's such a great idea because people on the left like it and people on the right like it. It's brilliant, right? We have such, you know, I mean, if you have a proposal that everyone likes across the politics, then surely it's going to happen. Slight problem, the people on the left defend a very different proposal than the people on the right. So sure, they might all like the idea of basic income, but when it gets to the details, competition and opposition comes in again, right? So when we think about social policy, we also need to think about the politics, right? So those are 3 things. When we go through the next couple of weeks, think about that. Think about design, think about policy effects, think about political effects, think about how they all relate to each other, right? So here's a very kind of question that I kind of also want to put in your brain and, you know, keep that as you're going through this course. there's a big debate about, you know, is basic income this total radical proposal, or is it, you know, just sort of tweaking with the system? You know, or maybe it's both. Maybe it's a bit of both. Maybe it's partly radical, a very departure. Maybe we're off to the new phase of the welfare state. Or, you know, or maybe not. Maybe this is just a good way to tweak some of the things that are going wrong, but fundamentally we're still in the same kinds of system. We try to fix the social contract, but we're staying within the same parameters, right? So big kind of question, big part of the debate. And 3 challenges, and then I'm going to stop, right? What are the sort of things that we really have to think about? Well, first, there's the evidence challenge, you know? I mean, what do we actually know about basic income? Well, basic income has one big problem. It doesn't actually really exist anywhere. So it's not like we can go somewhere, see how it works, and then come back and say, right, now that we know this, we're going to have to do it. We have to figure it out. So then the problem is, so we can do several things. One of the things we can do is we can do experiments, which is exactly, of course, what your government's proposing, right? So, but experiments can give you some information, but not all of it, because, you know, they're a lot more limited. Or we can look at programs that look a bit like basic income, not quite the same, and see what happens. But again, you know, we have to be careful looking at the results there and simply transposing it to the real idea. So evidence is a serious issue, you know. These days, everyone talks about evidence-based policy making. But if the evidence is very hard to get to, then, you know, we need to get creative, right? So definitely a challenge. There's also a policy challenge. The policy challenge is to make basic income fit in an existing system. I mean, so here is a very different scenario. People often argue in saying that, well, we've done some trials, some pilots in Namibia and in Brazil and in South Africa, and they work really well. Yeah, and one of the reasons why they work really well is because basically there wasn't anything else before. You know, it's easy to build something when there's nothing. It's very different when you have an existing welfare state with a lot of programs and a lot of structure and a lot of institutions. And somehow we need to fit basic income in there, you know. So when you implement basic income in Finland, it's not just about putting in basic income. You need to start thinking about what changes do we need to do in the tax system. What changes do we have to do in some other programs? They're going to be replaced, they're going to be added, and so on. A lot of design questions, a lot of political questions, a lot of issues, right? So we need to think about, do we have to transform the policy to make it fit? Or, you know, do we have to change the policy? Or do we have to transform the environment? Or a bit of both? So big questions there, right? And then finally, of course, the political challenge. We need to have clear political strategies to move a basic income ahead, given what I've said before. I mean, you know, policy effects means winners, losers. So how do you build a policy and a proper constituency and a proper coalition